Nuremberg, November 1945. A psychologist named Gustav Gilbert is sitting across from Hermann Goring, not in the courtroom, in a cell 3 weeks before the trials formally begin. His job is to assess the psychological state of the men charged with crimes against humanity, and what he finds across the following months is something nobody in that building wanted him to find. These men are not insane. Göring's IQ assessment comes back at 138. The average score across all 21 defendants is 128. By every clinical measure available at the time, there is no diagnosable pathology, no evidence of psychotic break, no sign of the kind of derangement that would explain what these men oversaw. They are, by the instruments Gilbert has, functionally normal. He asks Göring directly at one point how an entire nation could be brought to participate in what that nation participated in. Göring's answer, recorded verbatim in his 1947 book, Nuremberg Diary, is this: you tell them they're under attack. You tell them the pacifists are traitors. It works in any country. That's not politics. That's a clinical description of a psychological mechanism. And it connects with uncomfortable precision to something Carl Jung had been trying to articulate in academic journals for 20 years before anyone in that building had ever heard the word Auschwitz. By the end of this video, you'll understand what Jung spent a career trying to get people to take seriously, and what institutions spent equal energy avoiding. The reason had nothing to do with being fringe. The theory was accurate. He called it the shadow. Not the pop psychology version, which is mostly incomplete. The real theory is stranger, more structural, and far more visible in the historical record than the self-help summaries suggest. We'll start with what the shadow actually is. Then we'll look at what Jung did in 1936, a public intervention that cost him professionally and has been contested ever since. And then we'll get to what he only wrote explicitly in 1951 when he was 75 and past caring about the diplomatic version. There's also the question of what happened to Jung himself. That part matters. We'll get there. Jung built the shadow concept across several decades of clinical work. The clearest theoretical statement is in Aion, published in 1951, and in Psychology and Religion, delivered as lectures at Yale in 1937. The version most people have encountered goes roughly like this: your shadow contains what you repress. Everything you've decided you aren't: anger, envy, the capacity for cruelty. The prescription is find your shadow, integrate it, become whole. That's not wrong. It's just the beginning of the argument. Jung's actual claim is structural. The shadow doesn't only collect what is ugly, it collects everything that doesn't fit the identity a person or a culture has decided to project. A culture built around reason and progress pushes down religious impulse, raw instinct, the hunger for transcendence. A culture that prizes collective strength buries vulnerability, and institutions whose authority depends on appearing trustworthy deposits everything it does to maintain that appearance into a shadow it cannot afford to examine. The clinical problem is that what gets pushed down doesn't stay quiet, it accumulates pressure. Past a certain threshold, it finds a way outward. The mechanism is projection. When the psyche cannot tolerate some aspect of itself, the pushing down happens automatically, below the level of deliberate thought. What was buried surfaces as a perception about the outside world, attributed to someone else, somewhere else. The person who cannot acknowledge their own envy experiences everyone around them as envious. The person who has buried their rage finds that external aggression becomes the dominant feature of their reality. This is documented clinical observation, not metaphor. Researchers in social psychology arrived at the same conclusions through entirely different methods. studying how groups turn on outsiders under pressure, how people blame others for what they can't face in themselves, how communities identify enemies when they're under stress. The vocabulary is different from Jung's. The mechanism they describe is identical. Now apply that mechanism to something larger than an individual. In October 1936, Jung published an essay in a mainstream Swiss academic journal. He titled it Wotan, the Germanic god of storms, war ecstasy, and chaos. In it he argued that what was happening in Germany was not primarily a political event, but a psychological one, that an entire nation was in a state of what he called Ergriffenheit, seizure, or possession by an archetypal force dormant for centuries, now erupting through the collective psyche. The first concentration camps had been operational since 1933, and Jung is publishing in a Swiss academic journal that what the world is watching is not the rise of fascism exactly, but a mass psychological eruption. His critics focused on the political implications, whether framing Nazism through Jungian archetypes functioned as a form of excuse-making, as deflection from individual and institutional responsibility. That debate has continued ever since, and it is worth having seriously. But the question it tends to crowd out is simpler. Was he right about the mechanism? The collective dimension of Jung's psychology had been developing since at least 1916. The argument is that human beings inherit not only biology but psychological structure, patterns of response, what he called archetypes, activated by specific conditions. Extreme collective stress, mass humiliation, the desperate need to rebuild a broken sense of identity around something, anything, that holds. When those conditions converge in an entire population at once, the result no longer looks like individual psychology. It looks like something operating through a group as a single entity. Now scale the projection mechanism to a nation that has experienced military defeat, economic collapse, mass unemployment, and the political terms of Versailles, all within a single generation. A nation with no institutional structure capable of processing that volume of collective grief and rage. That grief and rage go somewhere. They build, they find a target. The projection is experienced as reality. This is the part most historical accounts miss. The people doing the projecting are not operating cynically. They genuinely believe in the threat. The existential danger is felt to be real because psychologically, for the person inside the projection, it is. Which is the mechanism Göring described to Gilbert, without using Jung's vocabulary, in that Nuremberg cell. Hannah Arendt came at the same problem from a completely different direction. She reported on the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, and her dispatches produced one of the most contested phrases in 20th century political thought, the banality of evil. It gets misread almost every time it's quoted. The usual reading is that evil is ordinary, that ordinary people commit it. Arendt's actual argument is more specific. Eichmann had not become monstrous. He had stopped thinking, not in the sense of being unintelligent. He was capable of considerable bureaucratic complexity. He had suspended the function that would have asked, "What am I actually doing here?" Jung and Arendt were describing the same gap. The shadow doesn't require malevolent psychology. It requires the disabling of the capacity for self-examination, the internal voice that would otherwise ask, "Wait, what am I actually doing here, and why?" Stop for a second. What historical event, one you studied, one you thought you understood, looks different to you right now? I want to know. Drop it in the comments. I read them. They genuinely change what I focus on in this series. Now, the conclusion Jung only put in writing at 75, the part he'd been circling for 30 years. Aion is not an easy book. Dense with alchemical and theological references, it was written partly in response to a question that had followed Jung since the 1930s. If the framework predicted this, why did the catastrophe still happen? His answer involves Western civilization's entire moral architecture. In Aion, Jung argued that the moral framework dominant in Western thought, the framework that says ethical development means aligning with good and repudiating evil, generates the most dangerous form of shadow precisely because of how it is structured. The danger comes not despite its clarity about virtue, but because of it. The more rigidly a system defines its own goodness, the more violently it expels what doesn't conform to that image. The shadow grows in direct proportion to the claim to virtue. Jung was not talking about Christianity specifically, though he addressed it directly. He was making a structural claim applicable to any ideology, any institution, any state built on the conviction of its own moral legitimacy. The more absolute that conviction, the deeper the shadow it requires. The historical examples he cites are not obscure. The Crusades, the Inquisition, missionary projects carried out under the explicit logic of saving souls. What he keeps returning to is not the hypocrisy, the gap between stated values and actual conduct. Historians have always documented that gap. What he finds clinically significant is the sincerity. The perpetrators believed. The shadow was not strategic. It is always unconscious, or it is not the shadow. This is the dangerous idea, that the most catastrophic shadows belong to systems most certain of their righteousness. There is a detail about Jung himself that tends to get skipped. In 1933, he accepted the presidency of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy, an organization restructuring along ideological lines compatible with the new German government. During that period, he published editorials drawing distinctions between Germanic and Jewish psychology, language that at minimum gave intellectual legitimacy to categories the regime was actively promoting. His explanation, offered later and repeatedly, was that the position gave him leverage to protect Jewish psychiatrists still working in Germany. Some former students accepted this account, others, including people who had been close to him professionally for years, found it insufficient. The historical record here is genuinely unresolved. Scholars have been working it for decades. This is not a footnote that can be cleanly dismissed or cleanly condemned. But here is what the Jungian framework itself says about this situation. The man who constructed the most sophisticated available theory of collective shadow, who saw that mechanism operating with unusual clarity across an entire civilization, was not exempt from it in his own professional life. His own institutional pressures, his own identity as a major European intellectual, his own need to keep his position in a moment of crisis, may have led him to conclusions that served his situation rather than the truth, which is precisely the process the theory describes. That is not an attack on the theory, that is the theory. Jung was explicit about this in his later writing. Consciousness of the mechanism does not immunize you against it. Knowing about projection does not stop it from occurring. Awareness is, at best, an early warning system, one that requires constant attention and can still be overridden by sufficient collective force. Back to Nuremberg, Gustave Gilbert spent the rest of his working life returning to that question. How was it possible? His final published analysis in the Journal of Social Issues in 1950 concluded that the psychological conditions that produced the Nazi state were not unique to Germany. They were structural. They required collective humiliation, an available target to blame, and the widespread shutdown of the capacity to step back and examine what was actually happening. Those conditions, he wrote, could be reproduced. He was citing Jung without knowing it. What the shadow concept provides, what distinguishes it from political or historical analysis, is the mechanism, not just what happened, how the psyche constructs the conditions for it to happen, and why the same pattern appears in places that share nothing historically except the structural conditions for collective projection. The historian reads the archive. The psychologist looks at what the archive is projecting. This channel lives at that intersection. Next week, we take that mechanism, the one that makes ordinary people participate in things they would never have chosen individually, and we watch it operate in real time inside a single institution over 30 years. France, 1392. A king loses his mind in the middle of a forest. What his court does next is one of the most documented case studies in the history of power, maintaining itself around a center that has collapsed. The people who witnessed it wrote it down in detail because they couldn't make sense of it either. That's next week.